When we talk about the connection between science and literature, we often think of the genre science fiction. So, what is science fiction? Science fiction arose in the 19th century as a narrative mode defined by its characteristic forms of rationality, novelty, and realism. Science fiction is a cultural response to the revolutions in science and technology. Most typically, it depicts future developments in social organization, science, and technology. These altered our understandings of the universe, ourselves, the concept of time, and all of history. So, why was science fiction created? Science is often correlating with the facts of the world, inserting logic and order into our lives. Not having science fiction is the same as denying the existence of science itself. So, without science fiction, there wouldn't be science in the first place. Therefore, science fiction is unavoidable.
When we talk about science fiction or sci-fi, did it ever occur to you when did it all started? The text that links science with literature. Well, first off, the only name that you should remember when thinking about who started science fiction is Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley was born in 1797 and was the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a renowned feminist writer and philosopher. Her mother's name kind of makes you think about Minecraft, if you ask me. Back to the point, how did Mary Shelley started the science fiction genre? It turns out, she was the writer of the well-known story Frankenstein. Frankenstein was published on 1st January 1818. Of course, it has elements of gothic fiction and also romanticism. But she also implemented science fiction into it. To cut it short, Frankenstein is generally about the story of a young scientist named Victor Frankenstein, who creates a disturbing-looking monster or creature in an unorthodox scientific experiment. Most people often mistaken the name of the creature. They usually call it Frankenstein, but that is not true at all. Frankenstein is the name of the scientist, not the creature he created. Now, how does this relate to science and literature? Simply put, it connects the act of science experiments and turn into literature form. It actually heightens and enhances the story written, and this story is the first ever that implements science. Where did science fiction become a big thing? Now that we know how it started, time to explain a little bit about when did it become a huge hit. Some of the science fiction stories published during the Victorian era includes Around the World in 80 Days by Julius Verne and also The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. Now, if you remember, I talked about Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. It is true that she implemented science fiction into her writing, but it was in general. Taking The Time Machine, for example, it explains in detail how time traveling works. The explanations were very specific that it could convince us that time traveling can actually be true.
Many writers began adapting science into their writing, and they used science to represent the inner world in new ways, as they believed that science intimated sensations, thoughts, and feelings outside the range of lived experience. Apart from that, they used science to describe new emotions and experiences. Back then, there were a number of writers who already wrote about the fantasies of Time Machine, but H.G. Wells was the first writer who has successfully made the fantasies of Time Machine seem real and impactful. In The Time Machine, Wells incorporated the issues that occurred during the Victorian times, such as industrialization, urbanization, and social stratification. He portrayed the lives of the upper class and the working class through the characters of Eloy and Morlox. In his famous work, Wells talked about how social stratification and social class disparity had split humanity into two species such as the Eloy and Morlox. In this story, the two main characters present the idea of evolution, also known as Darwinism. The Eloi are presented as physically weak compared to the Morlocks, vegetarian, and live their carefree lives happily in peace, and this has led them to their arrogance. Other than that, the Eloi are presented as the upper class beings that are unemployed and live off the Morlocks through exploitation. Meanwhile, the Morlocks are presented as physically more powerful compared to the Eloi, harder workers, and are slightly more intellectually aware than the Eloi. The representation of the Morlocks exemplifies the working class during Victorian era, where the people who belonged to that particular class had to work extra harder so that the upper class could benefit from them and their hard work. During the Victorian times, most of the people from the upper class, which consisted of aristocrats, wealthy family who worked in the Victorian courts, dukes and nobles, did not have to work for centuries as they had sufficient money to fund their families' lavish lives. These are the issues that are being highlighted in The Time Machine by H.G. Wells to show how the two main characters in the book resemble the real social class disparity during the Victorian era.
Over the years, science has directly affected the world of literature in various ways. One of the most prominent aspects of how science have impacted literature is through the technological advancements that have evolved the printing press, thus opening new and broader audiences. The innovation of incorporating cloth into the cycle of papermaking created more durable books and increased the amount of paper production. This resulted in the birth of paperback books, making literature affordable and accessible for the lower social class. Today, with the internet, there is a surplus of self-publishers of all ages. This also made way to various forms of literary works such as flash fiction and literature. Technology and science is all around us. Rapidly growing influence of technology has altered the way in which we live and think. The cultural, social, and economic life of man has drastically changed. Science and technology both profoundly influence the development and reception of literature. Technology is a major player in this regard. In the end, science and literature hangs on parallel lines where according to D.H. Lawrence, a renowned novelist, science studies human beings in its partial form, whereas literature studies a human being in its full form.